Good afternoon, and welcome to the Fisher Library's video podcast series, Between the Pillars. It's April 22nd. My name is John Shoesmith. I'm the outreach librarian here at the Fisher. And I know it's been a little while since we did a Between the Pillars podcast. We were taking a little bit of a hiatus. And also the last one we did on our Ukrainian holdings was such a powerful one. We wanted that to resonate with the audience. So we took a few weeks off, but we are back. We're going to be back doing the podcast bi-weekly up until the summer months. So just watch our website for the schedule coming up. Over the next two episodes, though, we're going to be going outside our usual practice of highlighting Fisher staff, and instead introducing you to a couple of important users of Fisher material. And we're going to introduce you to two of the library's what I call super users and instructors. They've both done a lot of their own research here at Fisher for their own scholarly interests, but they've also been important instructors here, particularly in teaching iSchool students and English department the history of the book. And so without further ado, I will introduce Alan Galey, Professor Alan Galey. Alan is a prof at the iSchool. He's also the outgoing director of the Book History and Print Culture Collaborative Program, which for those that don't know, it's an interdisciplinary, boy, that's hard to say, interdisciplinary graduate program here at U of T. It's sponsored by the English department and the iSchool, and with participation as well with Massey College. So we're going to talk a bit about that program, especially Alan's role as being the director for how many years, Alan, were you director?
Well, considering some years have more than 12 months in them, I think the last 2 years count more, but it's been 5 years normally, okay. But it was, it's funny because it's like there's the pre-2020 years and then there's 2020 and after.
Exactly.
5 years technically.
But we'll talk a bit about the program itself, some of the things that Alan has learned as well from his own students by teaching that. And we're going to show some Fisher materials, both that Alan has used over the years in his classes, that he's used in his own research. And I think it's going to be a fun episode. So thank you, Alan, for joining us.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
So I was trying to think back of when I first would have met you, because I went through the program pre-Alan Galey. I was there going through then the Faculty of Information Studies from 2003 to 2005. And
you would have studied with the great Patricia Fleming then.
And Patricia Fleming was, she was one of the instructors I had, and she's amazing. She's a remarkable woman in so many ways. And I remember when they said, oh, there's going to be someone replacing Pat Fleming, we thought, well, who could possibly replace Pat Fleming? And then Alan came in, and I mean, Alan has brought a different bent to it as well, using some of, the core book history principles that have been developed by pioneers such as Pat Fleming. But I think Alan, as we'll talk about a little bit, has brought a little bit of his own little spin on it as well. So Alan, remind me then, when did you start at the iSchool?
That was 2008.
Okay.
So
you're not from Toronto, are you, though?
No, I'm from Vancouver Island originally,
okay.
Though I did my PhD at University of Western Ontario here in
okay.
London, Ontario, just down the road, and spent a lot of time in Toronto when I was studying there, including that was when my first Fisher visit happened as well.
Tell us about that, actually. I'm curious about the first time you ever visited the Fisher, and what was it for? What were you researching?
Well, my PhD thesis way back when was on history of, mostly history of Shakespeare editing, but it crossed over with the history of the book as well, as the study of editing should, right. And history of, and media history in Shakespeare as well. But that naturally led me to the Fisher at the time. I mean, Western has excellent special collections in its own library, but I partly just wanted an excuse to visit the Fisher.
Right.
I'm not the first person to have that as a factor in bringing me through the doors, but I came here to look at I think it was Edmund Malone's late 18th century edition of Shakespeare, which is very, very important. Right. And I still remember coming in and being confused by the elevators. And I remember coming in, it was great staff, very welcoming. I remember Luba was on the desk. I met Luba then, and I left thinking that the reading room was actually 2 floors up. I didn't realize that the elevator I'd taken went down. even though there's a great big window reminding you you're on street level. So anyway, yeah, my first
Someone
visit.
actually did that today. Actually, didn't realize that. Oh, I'm on the ground floor. And my locker's upstairs. So
Yeah, somewhere Umberto Eco is like
yes.
nodding. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, it was a great visit. And then I remember once I started at U of T, it was Richard Landon took me on not just one, but 2 tours of the stack here. Actually, maybe I'll pan up as I'm talking, just so our audience can be reminded of what the architecture looks like. I'm in the McLean Hunter room, which is where we have classes, but also functions and things like that. And you can see many of the stacks there. There's the 2 pillars that were between as well.
I should
Anyway,
tell people I'm in the building as well, but because of COVID protocols, I'm actually up on 4M, which is our viewing platform here that visitors can come and take a look at the wide expanse of the Fisher.
Podcast command center.
Exactly.
Yeah, Richard.
Do you remember what Richard was showing you? He's probably showing you everything.
Actually, well, one of the books I have on the table is the 1922 Shakespeare and Company first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses. Okay. But I mean, the Shakespeare folio, first folio, but he showed me all 4, which we have 4 here. Charles Polanyi's Nobel Prize medal, which I was able to hold in my hand and realize how heavy it was. Gray's elegy with the paths of glory lead but to the grave underlined. Quite a number. It was very, very memorable. I mean, I had artifact vertigo at the end of it. It was overwhelming, I think, as many people do. It was an introduction, though, not just to the objects, but I think to the ethos of the Fisher, which Richard modeled for so many of us, which is this is a place to be curious, and it's a place to interact and actually see the objects here. It's not just housing objects.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, preservation is part of what we do. It's an important part of what we do because we want the materials here for another 200, 300 years, but we want them used at the same time. Yeah,
they're not here just to sit in the dark in the silence. They're for something, and that really, you know, I picked that up from Richard, as so many of us did, but also the rest of the Fisher staff, you, PJ, so many of the others, and not just that, but also an ethos of connectivity and curiosity outside of your disciplinary comfort zone. And that's something that I really absorbed from being around here, I think, because you'd walk into the Fisher, and Richard, or maybe somebody else, you know, you and I have had this conversation, I think, in the reading room where you can wave me over and, hey, check this out. And, you know, I think, you know, you showed me something amazing from Canadian smaller private presses or something like that I wouldn't have known about if it weren't for those sort of conversations. And I like to think of the Fisher as a good place for that, but also it's an ethos that is part of the field of book history, but also the book history and pre-culture program too, where, you know, we've got so many different interests and backgrounds mixed together, and it's a challenge, but it's fun.
It must be, I don't know if I guess it's a blessing in some ways when you're teaching the history of books and printmaking, that you have this incredible resource. But on the other hand, maybe it's also intimidating at the same time because the collection is so large. There's so many different areas you can explore. I mean, when you were first hired and you knew you're going to be teaching history of the book, did you kind of wrap your head around sort of, how am I going to do this with this massive collection?
I still am. I mean, I don't think there's a point, you know, I wonder what Richard or PJ would say. I don't think there's a point where you feel like, yeah, I've got it. There are certain things that, you know, strengths of the collection that, you know, you can draw on, and things you feel comfortable with, and books you start thinking of as old friends in a way. There's some of them we'll look at shortly here. But I mean, that's one thing about this library, and maybe it's true of all libraries, that it's something that exists on a scale that exceeds any one human's ability to comprehend, much less master. So that's you know, once you accept that, I find that actually a liberating thing, because then you can be a student, and then you can realize, you know, sometimes the best learning happens over a long time scale, not all at once, not with an end product foremost in mind.
Were you interested then in history of books then, even from when you were earliest undergrad days, or even going back to high school, or was that something that was kind of, you know, you acquired during your PhD studies?
It's funny, I think I actually picked it up more. I've had much of the influences that have shaped those interests are in the last 10, 12, 15 years. I mean, it was always I was a voracious reader growing up. You know, I devoured Stephen King, and still read, you know, things like that, Tolkien and things like that too. But I was also really interested in the history of media and computing, and the possibilities, you know, of humanities computing as a field, which was emerging well, it's always been emerging over the latter half of the 20th century, but I was able to experience some of it when I was an undergrad and then a master's student and then PhD student. But the history, the book history side of it, I was interested in editing and textual scholarship and studying the transmission of texts through time and media and other sort of agents. But the history of books and the kind of teaching you do with books on the table as objects, that I really only started to do once I was here. And the Fisher was a big part of that. Massey College as well, of course. And we're so lucky here at U of T and in Toronto more broadly, in that we're in a city with great libraries, but thriving book arts community, even after 2 very difficult pandemic years. But yeah, for me, the book history side of it, the teaching with objects on the table, that's this room in many ways that I'm in right now, where I had to learn how to do that, and I'm still learning how to do that.
Yes, even we're all still learning how to do that. I mean, I've been here, I was telling you, since 2005, and I mean, using the materials and teaching the materials in seminars and in these smaller seminars, especially that we do at the Fisher, I find such a rewarding experience, and I'm sure that's something you could talk to as well.
Well, it's especially this year. I mean, this was the year, like I didn't teach in 2020. In 2021, I didn't set foot in a classroom,
right,
of course, because of the restrictions for the pandemic. This year, I was able to teach my fall course entirely in a classroom. It wasn't a book history course, although it was on the history of media. But this year, of course, we had to start out because of Omicron showing up. We had to, the first half of the term basically was online, and then it was just toward the end, I was able to have my first classes in the Fisher and take both of my courses. I was teaching the PhD seminar in the book history program, and that was on digitization and born digital texts. But I was also teaching a course called The Future of the Book for the Faculty of Information, which I've taught for many years. And I was able to bring that class in as well, because it's, there are some things you can't simulate on a screen, even though we will attempt to podcast, it's still a representation on a screen of something that exists in another form somewhere else. So it was really, really good to be able to do that. And something I'll never take for granted again, I think, as so many of us have been realizing.
Yeah, I got to do my first class for Trent University, came in fall, in November, and it was just, I hadn't done it for over 18 months. And it was great to be able to actually interact. This is pre-Omicron. Just to be able to interact with a dozen or so students and show materials again, which is, what we've been trying to do, obviously, in a virtual world using our document camera, but there's no replacement really for the materiality of the objects. So,
although I think it's useful to think of these things not as one replacing the other, because as we're heading to a messy new phase, there, we've learned to do things that we don't want to stop doing. So if you think of the like what we're doing here, think of it as a supplement to the in-person thing. I think that's a productive way to do it too, because once you put the surrogacy aside and look at other forms of relationship between digital representations and the things, then you don't get stuck in that either or. But as you were saying, maybe this is the experience you had too. It's the conversations over the objects that that are really valuable too.
Yes, got you. So why don't we, now that we're talking materiality, let's see some materials.
Sure.
So why don't you put on the camera?
Okay, I'm going to switch document. I'm going to switch to the document camera here. There we go. Okay, we can see the title page there. Okay. Well, I thought
this is a throwback to your PhD years, isn't it? When you're about Shakespeare?
I wish I'd known about this in my PhD years. This is something that I think I only, a book I only learned about because I was able to explore here at the Fisher. Actually, I think I learned about this book when I was part of the Shakespeare exhibition that the Fisher put on a number of years ago, led by Scott Schofield. With some
and just to tease that out, by the way, Scott is going to be the next guest on Between the Pillars. So
yes, and Scott, speaking of great conversations over books, you don't get better than conversations with Scott for sure. Anyway, this is a book that was in that exhibition. It's one of the most interesting editions of Hamlet that I know of. This particular book was printed in 1930 in Weimar, Germany. It's the English version there in 1928. There was a German version printed. This book is I thought I would pull this one up because it's an example of, not just because it's Shakespeare, but it's an example of a book as a performance. And like all performances, it's a collaboration. So I'll spend a little bit of time on the title page before we get to the interior of it. But you can even the title page gives a hint about this. The really key name here is Edward Gordon Craig.
Right.
And he was the son of Ellen Terry, the great 19th century Shakespeare actor. And Edward Gordon Craig himself was a scenic designer and someone who designed performances. And in 1911, 1912, he collaborated with Stanislavski on a really influential and important production of Hamlet in Moscow.
Okay.
And it was an example of modernist aesthetic being applied to Shakespeare. They weren't wearing ruffs, they weren't looking back, they weren't trying to reproduce some real or imagined past. This was modernism in all of its kind of starkness and futurity. Anyway, I can say a bit more about Craig as I page through the book. It was printed for, as it says here, it's printed by Count Harry Kessler at the Chronic Press, Weimar, 1930. Harry Kessler was a German aristocrat, patron of the arts, and someone really interested in bookmaking. And he brought together Gordon Craig and a number of other people to work on what they were trying to make the best printed edition of Hamlet at the time. And maybe it's time to start paging through this. This is what a random opening here looks like. The typography here, I'm going to zoom in and then zoom out again. I want to get right into the type there because they did. So the type that we're looking at here was designed by Edward Johnston, who was a very important typographer, type designer. He did the London Underground font and other things. He was one of the collaborators on this, on cutting the type. There was also Eric Gill, very influential early 20th century type designer who did some of these illustrated capitals here. If you've ever used Gill sans serif on Microsoft Word, that's Eric Gill. There were, many other people who were involved in this, but the genesis of this book was that 1911, 1912 Moscow Hamlet performance.
Right.
And you see these figures here. These are actually echoes of actual cardboard or small wooden figures that Edward Gordon Craig would use to plan out scenes. Actually, not to plan scenes exactly, but to experiment with the possibilities of staging. He would make these little scale models of stages, and he would have these, what were called black figures, what he called black figures. Sometimes they represented specific characters, but more often they would represent like abstract qualities, like fear or lust or envy or something like that. And anyway, he would model out his scenes using these figures, and Harry Kessler saw these and thought, hey, these would be really interesting. What if you put ink on them and impress them onto paper? So these are, it's not the same actual pieces of wood, I think, except in one case. Yeah, I think this was one of his I think this is the only one in the book. I could be wrong. I think this is right, though. This is the stage manager. This is the only one that's actually printed from one of Edward Gordon Craig's actual black figures. But these guys show up throughout the book, partly to balance out pages, things like this, but also
an amazing book design. Like the design of this is astounding.
And notice how the different openings, very few of them are exactly the same. Here's one of my favorites as well. Yeah. This is Hamlet and the players early on in Act 2, Scene 2. The amount of care that went into the layout and the design, and also it's two different versions because of course the first one was in German, and then it was translated by Gerhard Hauptmann into German, and then they did the English version a couple of years later. So this is so there's these black figures that enhance that kind of bring the text to life here. Oh yeah, what's going on here too? Here and here in two columns, that's Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'll talk about the text in a bit here. What's going on the side here, though, is what they've also done is printed two of Shakespeare's sources for Hamlet. So, of course, you know, as the saying goes, Shakespeare could tell a great story if somebody told it to him first. So he was someone who always had, actually, I'm using a Scott Schofield metaphor here, as Shakespeare's workbench. We know some of the books that Shakespeare had on his desk when he was writing, things that he was reworking. So
he's not stealing stories, he's appropriating them.
yeah, invention is the Renaissance word for it. Invention in the sense of inventory. Yeah, Shakespeare was, he would have been no stranger to remix culture in the present, for sure. Yeah, so what we have here are two of the sources that Shakespeare used. One, Saxo Grammaticus' Life of Amleth from the 13th century, and François de Belfort's Histoire Tragique from 1570. So you can, what's interesting about this is not just the design of the book and how beautiful it is, but as you're reading, you can also see Shakespeare's materials in the margins right there in the same field of vision, and some glosses on the side here as well. The text, you know, with all the focus on the images, I'll show you some even better illustrations in a moment. The text was also edited for this edition by John Dover Wilson, who was one of the foremost bibliographers and textual scholars of the time, a member of a movement which at that time was called the New Bibliography. And so it was interesting that they went to the foremost, one of the most foremost textual scholars on Shakespeare at the time to ask, okay, can we have an edition of the text that is as forward-looking and as up-to-date as everything else here? John Dover Wilson based it on the second quarto of Hamlet. It's interesting in the back here, we'll end on some of the most spectacular images, but one of the things I like about this book is that it's got a book inside the book. So in the back here, we have Dover Wilson, and this is where they recorded all their decisions about the text, and this is where the textual variants are recorded. This is, you know, whether they chose for Hamlet to say, oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, or that this too solid flesh would melt. Well, that's textual scholarship and textual criticism, and that's all recorded in this other book that's has its own slipcase in the back here. Let's look at a couple of images and we can move on to something else here. So there's these black figures that are part of this thing. Notice it's also printed in red here. Some of the people who were involved in this actually were from the Kelmscott Press and William Morris's circle as well. Emery Walker was an advisor on this. So you can see that aesthetic looking back to early print and the use of color here. This would have had to be printed, would have gone under the press more than once to get the two different colors of ink. Yeah, here we go.
Well, you know, weirdly enough, I actually like this thing. I like this kind of production more than I would like a Kelmscott. I find, for me, my personal taste, my personal aesthetic, I find Kelmscott a little bit over the top.
Yeah, well, Morris was looking back as I mean, Emery Walker was looking back as well. This is looking forward. This is,
yes,
these
exactly.
are the punks. You know, this, yeah, these are the like the new wave punk types for that period. They were, and as just like the Stanislavski production, it was stripping away the decoration, the ornamental stuff, the curly keys and all that Victorian cruft as they would have seen it, to try to get to the essence of this very, very difficult text about, which was all about, you know, tyranny and a state going wrong and things like this. Here we have one of, here, notice the coloring here, that a couple of the figures are a little bit darker than the other two. I'm going to find a few other openings that do that. Oh yeah, here's another. Yeah, that's happening here too. I'll zoom back out. Notice, I mean, this is staging, right? Like this is depicting the play within the play, the mousetrap. But we also have, you know, even the sources around it function like a proscenium stage presenting it. So it really is an example of a book as a performance in its own way, not just a record of a performance, but the book itself as a kind of performance. Here we go. I've got all these. Yeah, it's Hamlet at the beginning. Yeah, here we go. This is another one that was right out of Gordon Craig's drawings here. So this is, here we go. So this is, yeah, here's Hamlet at the court, isolated, looking in a different direction as the king and queen, Polonius and Gertrude, or not Polonius, Claudius and Gertrude on the throne, and then everybody looking at them at the beginning of the play. And so they would have masked, this would have been printed twice with different inks and masked. So the amount of work and precision that went into getting this effect was quite extraordinary. So when I think of this as a collaboration, I think of it as a collaboration also with the printers, with the ones who were actually printing this thing. And that's a kind of thing that the book history program really emphasizes, is that an object like this is the product of many, many hands, some of whom are invisible,
yeah,
but nonetheless present.
I mean, that was one of the things I was going to ask you. How would you do something like this in a classroom setting? And I was thinking exactly about that, about how do you get, I mean, you know, most people are familiar with how to use Photoshop, for example, where they can easily manipulate imagery. But when something is going through a letterpress, it's not so easy.
That's right. That's one of the things that in book history that we really try to carry over from bibliography, especially analytical bibliography, is to look at something like this not just as a product, not just as a static thing, but as a process.
Right.
And to imagine the process and the temporality that is part of this thing's nature. Here we have another Hamlet about to stab the wrong person. Yes, here's a bit of color as well. Speaking of that process, so here the sheet that this leaf is from would have had to go into or at least the side of it would have had to go into the press at least 3 times. Here we have some blue. I think it's the only other time they use a color other than black or red, depicting Ophelia. And anyway, you can.
So there's a little silhouette, I guess, of Ophelia, right, in within the blue. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's get right in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are, I mean, what's so fascinating about these two is that they're not just illustrations, they're interpretations of the text as well. And that also emphasizes something that's important, I think, that a note that we're often hitting in the book history program is books as participants in the world of literature, and not just literature, but science and history and the arts and all the other disciplines that depend on books, which is essentially all of them. But yeah, it's a book that to me encapsulates a lot of important things about, oh yeah, there we go. Not just the history of this book, but the history of books as a field of study. And it's also, this is something I find inspiring to think about in terms of digital interface design as well. So I co-wrote an article with Rebecca Niles a number of years ago on that. Anyway, we'll end on the colophon there. This is also copy number 242. It was like all private press productions. There's not many of them out there. In fact, this was printed on 2 different kinds of paper. This is on the regular paper, but there's also copies were printed on Japanese imperial paper, and then and some copies on vellum too, which is, I think, only about 8 copies, at least of the English edition, was on vellum. Yeah,
and it's great. I mean, this is. I mean, when people think about Fisher and our Shakespeare collection, they often point to, say, the four 17th century folios that we have. But yet these, I think, are just as exciting and integral to our Shakespeare collection as the folios, and in many ways they're actually more interesting to look at. This is very similar too to what we were going to show as well. We're going to show Barbarian Press's play of Pericles, which matches up well with this, because again, it's also a very theatrical book. It's actually behind an exhibition case right now, so we couldn't bring that out, unfortunately. But very similar books, very similar aesthetic as well.
Well, it shows we were thinking along the same lines, because I was like, hey, we should bring up the Barbarian Press. But
exactly.
It's in the Fisher's Greatest Hits collection up there.
Yes.
But the thing with the comparison to the Shakespeare, especially the first folio, for me is apt, because I mean, I was able to actually use the first folio and show my classes this year, and as I have other classes, which is I'm really, really privileged to be able to say that my students have been able to actually have classes with a copy of the folio present and see it, and and there are things you can learn from it. I mean, once you get past the kind of aura of the object and lean into it and start looking at details, there's much to learn from these things as books. But it's also, to me, it's a reminder too that a book like this is about where texts go, not just where they've been.
Right.
And the sources of transmission are essential. Of course, if we didn't have the folio, we wouldn't have Macbeth, we wouldn't have the Tempest, about half of Shakespeare's plays now. But it's what people have done with those things that I find so interesting, and especially inspiring for the future. And living in times when we could use some inspiration too.
Speaking of the future, why don't we move to one of your other interests, which is Marshall McLuhan.
Sure.
Because I know you have some. Interesting enough, one of the last times I saw Alan pre-pandemic was in New York City. We were both at NYU for a McLuhan symposium. Alan and I were both speaking there. So Ulysses, I mean, McLuhan, I guess, has he been an interest of yours for a while, or is that a recent discovery, or?
No, actually, it's a recent discovery. As somebody, maybe I'll switch back the camera here just briefly, and then I'll explain why it's Ulysses and not Finnegan's Wake on the table, as people are probably wondering. But no, I mean, as somebody who did training in the history of media, of course, you read McLuhan. He's essential reading in that. There's a very good chance we wouldn't have a book history program. There's so many things we wouldn't be doing if McLuhan hadn't established that here at the University of Toronto. And of course, the McLuhan Center here is a vibrant, ongoing place of scholarship and community here at the University of Toronto, and has been for many years, but really has had a renaissance in the last few years, thanks to some excellent directors. But no, for me, McLuhan was somebody who I read with great frustration and consternation, because I'm trained as a book historian, as an historical scholar, but like McLuhan, I came from literature, literary studies, and I think McLuhan never stopped being a literary scholar and a reader, as we know from the fact that his library is now here at the Fisher. So yeah, McLuhan was somebody who I would read now and again and dip into Gutenberg Galaxy or something like that, or Understanding Media, and find it interesting, but as somebody from book history, I want footnotes. I want the record of the scholarship. I want the trails that would lead me back to the things he looked at. So, if I'm going to read about the influence that Gutenberg had, I'm going to read Adrian Johns and other people in the field of book history. And so for years, that's kind of where I parked McLuhan in my imagination, like many people in my field. But when his library came here and I was able to look at his own copies of his books, I got to know McLuhan the reader a little bit, and that was a whole other story. And that to me humanized him, took him out of this, I mean, the other thing McLuhan is, of course, he's the object of a lot of hagiography and kind of almost fetishistic reverence.
That's for sure.
And yeah, which is sometimes gets in the way of having a good conversation around him, and kept me away from that for many years. But I think we've had excellent directors of the McLuhan Center who knew what to do with that. And also it was the symposium that you and Sarah Sharma organized here in this room on many McLuhans, which right there in the title, I thought it was such a wonderful choice of title, because it let people like me find an entranceway in, not just to the one McLuhan you're supposed to revere, but to the many different McLuhans, which is probably closer to what he actually was as a scholar and a reader.
And it's nice you can marry to the interests, because obviously, I mean, you call it, I think you could refer to it as like reading over McLuhan's shoulder, right? Because for those that don't know, the McLuhan Library, which is somewhere in the lines of 4,500 books, I would say, so many of them are very heavily annotated by McLuhan himself, largely on the fly leaf, but also within the book itself. And are you going to show us?
Yeah, let's take a look. Yeah, and we can talk about this as we look at it. Yeah, it's a little bit like reading over his shoulder. I mean, of course, when I think about, book history is its own field. The history of reading is its own field as well. It's not reducible to the history of books, and and it's closely tied to the history of annotation and marginalia. I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. Tell me if the glare or the shadow gets in the way.
It's fine.
Okay, all right. I just opened a bit from Aeolus there.
It's interesting because on one hand, with the Hamlet you were showing, it has its own sort of sense of marginalia as well. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a great point. We were just looking at some printed marginalia, things that were added. Here we're going to look at some reader added marginalia by McLuhan. Well, mostly Marshall McLuhan, but his son Eric McLuhan has annotated this one a little bit too. This is his copy of the 1961 Modern Library edition.
One of his copies, we should say.
McLuhan. This is where I began to really develop a respect for McLuhan as a reader. He owned multiple editions of the same text. James Joyce, arguably his favorite literary author anyway, top two, probably top. I mean, McLuhan referred to his own media theory as applied Joyce, which was a wonderful phrase. And he would often say that, well, actually his son Eric once wrote that when McLuhan thought he'd come up with an insight, he would open up Finnegan's Wake and realize Joyce got there first. And Finnegan's Wake was something that was the book that he referred to most. I went to Ulysses when I was studying McLuhan because Ulysses is the Joyce that I know along with the others. I mean, I haven't read Finnegan's Wake. Someday I'll be able to read it. I don't feel like I'm there yet.
Maybe just read the McLuhan copy with his annotations.
Yeah, well, that's because with McLuhan, seeing him annotate works like this, we get to see somebody struggling with a difficult text.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very different McLuhan than the kind of, pop culture icon. This is someone who is a student and a reader doing careful work, which, and there's a joy in his reading too, which I quite like. There's a connectivity. He would, he was an excellent reader of Joyce in that sense, because that's the kind of reader I think Joyce would have appreciated. Anyway, here's the opening. When we're talking about Marginalia, here's the opening to, so I'll try to get my shadow out of there. This is the opening to the episode Proteus, third episode in we usually call them episodes in Ulysses rather than chapters. Joyce didn't add chapter headings or anything like that. They just, usually one ends and then the other begins. This is a point in the book where a lot of readers bail out because the opening sentence, ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that, if no more, thought through my eyes. Signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea rack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, and so on. Anyway, I'm not a Joyce scholar, so I won't attempt to explicate that passage, but
it's beautiful, actually, beautiful poetry in so many ways.
It is, and it's Stephen Dedalus working through the evidence of his senses and making poetry of it too, and connecting it to poetry too. He quotes from Dante, not too far below, a few lines down there. Anyway, you can see, if you can see here, this is what McLuhan was doing around the edges, is teasing out words, especially ineluctable. He was like, oh, let's unpack the word ineluctable. It takes a certain moxie to start a chapter with a word like ineluctable. And here he is teasing out the word lux, the Latin word, but also not, and things like that. Right. There's a lot of cross references. He would remember things. And so this, if we turn to page 560, we'd find something, I'm certain. And then other things around the edges. He also had little bits of shorthand for his own ideas and things like that as well. Anyway, not all the pages are as heavily annotated, but this is of course, a very important passage. Also, notice him where Joyce varies that opening phrase to ineluctable modality of the audible, underlined in pen. Of course, that could be Eric's underlining in pen. We don't know, too. Andrew McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan's grandson, is the expert, I think, on this library, and he's able to look at these things and often say, I know whose hand that is. And I know that you've got a wonderful talk that he and his father gave about the McLuhan Library in the
YouTube page.
Yeah. The other thing that McLuhan would often do, one of the other annotation techniques that he would employ, is to make his own indexes in the flyleaves and end papers at the back here. So here you can see there's page and topic references. Here we go. If I open that up, he's really interested in clothing here for whatever reason. Right. Sometimes with this copy and some others, I've been able to trace it into things he's actually quoted. So on page 720 here, it says add. If we went to 720, we'd see a passage where Leopold Bloom is reflecting on advertising and the nature of advertising, which of course from McLuhan. Right. This is the person who said advertising was going to turn out to be the greatest poetry of the 20th century. I think he was speaking to advertisers when he said it, but anyway. So you can see somebody at work as a reader, not just recording their thoughts, but also making this into an object they can use, as many of our students do. I bet your books look a bit like this, or things like that too, as a reader.
I always tell, whenever students come in and when we do seminars, I always tell them, never write on a library book you take out from Robarts, but your own copy, just go to town on it, because you may be surprised picking it out 10, 15 years later, what you were thinking.
Yeah, that's right. It's a way to have a conversation with your past and future selves.
Exactly.
And well, anyway, one of the things that a book like this is very, very useful for, I'm going to get another one set up here while I'm talking, is the study of marginalia as part of book history. And that's something that was really established for the field of book history by Heather Jackson, who is Professor Emerita here at the University of Toronto from the Department of English, a wonderful colleague and supporter of the book history program, and someone who's writing on marginalia really helped.
Another heavy user of the Fisher collections.
Yes, and someone who has helped us learn how to use marginalia, what questions to ask it, what to listen for, so to speak. And anyway, this is one of the kinds of things that we often do in the book history program. One of the assignments I'll often set for the students is go find an annotated book and profile it.
Right.
And tell, okay, what were they annotating? What can you learn from it? But also think about what questions it raises but can't answer as well, because marginalia often leaves us with unanswered questions. But even identifying the unanswerable ones is still part of scholarship. So anyway, with that assignment, I and others have used that assignment too. It's really based on Heather's work. Their option is they can look for somebody, for a known annotator like Cluhan. I've had others work on Coleridge's books or others. Right. Or they can just go find a random book from the stacks, and those can be just as interesting, even more so. Here's one that I wanted to look at briefly, because this is, we were looking earlier at his 1961 copy. He was using that after he'd already been an established published author on Cluhan. Here we are looking at his student copy of Ulysses. Actually, it's one of two copies I should mention. This is the little bit of the history on this. This is the other volume. This is the Odyssey Press Ulysses. This is the 1933 issue. It was the first publication was a few years before that. Right. Odyssey Press is an imprint of, or was an imprint of the Albatross Press, which was, anyway, there's a whole book on that, a wonderful book by Michelle Troy called Strange Bird, the Albatross Press and the Third Reich. This was a press printing modernist literature in Germany after 1933 and the rise of the Third Reich. So a bit of a cousin to Harry Kessler's Hamlet. I didn't mention at the time, but
similar time frame.
Yeah, and also Harry Kessler had left Germany by this time because he was opposed to the Nazi regime, and so like many people, he left and he lived out the rest of his life in exile in France and elsewhere. Anyway, so the Odyssey Press Ulysses is 2 volumes, and we're just looking at one of them. But this was also printed, it was an imprint created by the Albatross Press, partly to get Ulysses printed in England, because of course, Ulysses by 1933 was a banned book in most of the English-speaking world. It was banned in Canada, banned early in the United States. That was the first place in the English-speaking world it was unbanned. But anyway, so here we have Cluhan's copy that he owned when he was a student at Cambridge, studying with people like F.R. Leavis. Maybe I'll zoom right in there. So here again, there's that passage at the beginning of Proteus, intellectual malady of the visible, and you can see the student Cluhan. Of course, we don't know exactly when he made these marks, but writing here, he also, to zoom out here again, one of the things that is important about his library, like so many other writers, is that it's not just what he wrote on the books. There's also often slips of paper that were with the books. And it's great that the Fisher has kept those as well. And they're removed to separate folders, but I've kind of put some of these slips back in here.
The finding aid is very comprehensive in terms of noting where exactly all of these inserts have been removed, so the page numbers they've been removed from. So, exactly. So you can do exactly what you're doing right here is reconstructing it.
It's essential. Yeah, it's great that the finding aid passes that crucial test, because this gives us just a bit more of a picture of what this object was to him, which it wasn't just a book. It was just as many books are not just the manufactured objects. It's what they become in the hands of modifying readers. And so here I won't go into too much detail about this, but one of the things about Ulysses is that Joyce apparently had a kind of schema for the whole complex, intricate novel. So each episode has its scene, it has the hour where it takes place, it has a particular art that it focuses on. Subtextually, there's symbols. Anyway, this schema, which has come to us in two different versions, Cluhan has written out some of those key elements on pieces of paper and had them tucked in at the beginning of each of these episodes.
Right.
So he's given himself these little paratexts that he's added to guide his reading, which of course is what you do as a student. My favorite thing about this copy, well, there's many things to like about it. Yeah, there isn't one of those big indexes in the back, but it's also that, I mean, here's the other volume in this edition. So this is what it looks like. You know, it's paperback, not too expensive at the time. There's even the prices on the bottom. But Cluhan apparently made his own cover for this. And I just love the idea of Marshall Cluhan sitting down at a table with some grocery paper,
right,
something like that, and tape and scissors, and doing some arts and crafts to make a dust jacket for it.
Right, amazing.
And but he's also annotated it as well. There's text. Yeah, you can see a lot of his annotations on the back here.
Right.
And I've always wondered, was this also to conceal the fact that he was reading Ulysses? Because this was a banned book.
Yeah.
Even his teacher, F.R. Leavis, got in trouble apparently for bringing Ulysses into a classroom at Cambridge at one point, prior to when Cluhan was there. So, you know, was this also to do some clandestine reading of a banned book? On the other hand, if you were a student at that time, maybe reading a banned book like Ulysses, you know, had a cachet to it. So
right,
maybe you didn't want to conceal the fact that you're reading this edgy work of modernist literature. Who knows? But anyway, this is something that, for me, Cluhan, the reader, isn't just the Cluhan I see on the pages. It's the Cluhan who also made this object, interacted with Ulysses, and struggled with it just like the rest of us.
Yeah. Speaking of students, that may be a nice segue too into the final thing we're going to show, especially because, as you were telling me earlier, the next item we're going to look at is something that a student basically introduced you to.
Yes.
So just to show that, you know, even though, you know, I've been here 17 years, you've been here for, 12, 13 years at the iSchool, we still learn from the students themselves too.
Oh, absolutely.
And their windows into some of the materials that we have.
Yeah, and in fact, the only reason I even looked at Ulysses is because I was once a student of Michael Grodin, who was a great Ulysses scholar and a great teacher who sadly passed away just last year. But Mike was someone who wrote not just about Ulysses as an object of study from a scholarly perspective, but his final book was about living with Ulysses as a work of literature that travels with you through life. This is a very different kind of book, though. The one we're looking at here is
it looks like a mess. It looks like a scrapbook almost.
It is it's a productive mess, because this is it's a book about the English peerage. Basically it's a database in codex form, and late 19th century by George Cockayne. And it is this particular copy was George Cockayne's, Cockayne might have, Joycean slip there, might explain the way this book is. No, Cockayne had his publisher made a working copy for him to do corrections and things like that, interleaved with blank leaves, as you can see here. And of course, it being a work about the peerage, basically about genealogy and things like that, we may not be, even the most devout Downton Abbey fan might not be too interested in this book, but it's the kind of information that is where facts are important, very important, depending on who's related to whom and things like that. So as with other works of peerage or genealogy or heraldry or things like that, it's possible to be wrong. So you can see Cockayne working with this, and there's paste-ins here all over the place. There's like lots and lots of corrections and things like this. Anyway, I had a wonderful student named Virginia DeWitt several years ago in the book history program, and Virginia picked this for her, oh, hey, a fold up. Virginia picked this book for an assignment that we sometimes do a version of it. I think David Fernandez still has kept this going when he teaches books 1001, our core course, as have others. Basically, we call it the adopt a book assignment, and where a student picks a book from the collection, and they don't just write a one-off essay on that book. They get to know that book over the course of the term. They look at other editions of the book. They do this work in the form of different exercises, so short chunks rather than great big essays. And one exercise might be to transcribe the title page. Another essay might be to discuss the design and the layout, as we were looking at with the Chronic Press Hamlet. Another one would be to look at reader modifications. I'm sure Virginia did have tons of material to work with here, and also to look at the book as an economic object, as a commodity. How much did it cost? Who could afford it?
Right.
Who couldn't afford it? Things like that. So anyway, but this was of all the reader modified books in the Fisher collection, this one to me stands out as this is the kind of limit case in some way. So I always think of this as Virginia's book, and I've been showing it ever since then. So, but yeah, it's an example too of we learn from our students, as you were saying, and so much of what the students do in this library is discovery, finding something like this. When it comes to when you arrive at the reading room and you've called it out from the catalog, and I wonder what it'll look like.
Right.
And it's like this.
Yeah, it's like, whoa. And
what? Yeah, that's such a fun moment, and so it's nice that we're able to do it again, and nice that things like the book history program means that there's a community to do it within, that where we share what we know with each other as well through our symposium, which we were able to do our yearly grad student symposium through the pandemic on Zoom. We have public talks and things like that too. Our students are very active and often in sharing what they're doing in the program as well. So yeah, anyway, and this is just one of how many thousand books that are waiting here to be explored.
So why don't we just go back to gallery view? We can kind of
sure. I'll go back to that.
So in terms of all the years you've been the director of the program itself, what has been the most interesting part of it? What has been the most surprising part of it? What are you ultimately leaving? You're going to be leaving it in good hands. But what do you think you yourself have left the program?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In terms of what it's left, what it's given me is a sense of the range of work outside my own little area. Because if I hadn't been part of that program, there's a good chance well, at the Faculty of Information, breadth is an important thing there as well. And our curriculum is very connective. It is a kind of a crossroads of many different disciplines at the university. It results in rooms that the modern university is almost designed to prevent from happening in terms of the kind of combinations of people in the same space, which I love about it. And that's true of the book history program and other things we do here as well. So that breadth is something that I had to really reckon with as a teacher in the program and as a director of it. And I know it's a challenge that our other instructors in the program face and have been living up to in excellent ways as well. And because you have to have, you have to be able to connect with other people. We have 14 different units who participate in the book history program. Wow. And I'm hoping maybe even a couple more by the time I'm done, but that makes for a very diverse classroom. But as in all cases, diversity is absolutely worth pursuing and absolutely necessary to do, and absolutely takes work as well. Okay. And the work is worth it, but it's still work. And that means that I've had to learn about areas that I didn't think I was going to have to learn about. And it's good, but I also, doing that justice is something I worry about. And that's just part of the challenge when you come into the room. It also means like doing a kind of teaching where sometimes you're standing on the firm ground of your training, and sometimes maybe you've had this experience too, where you're talking about things you never thought you'd talk about. So that means that you also have to pay attention. Okay, what are the principles that you have learned that can carry? Right. And what are the limits too? Right. That's a tough thing. And doing the materials justice, but also doing justice to the range of knowledge and perspectives and backgrounds that are present too, which isn't just disciplines too. It's all these other things. So and I guess it's the value of expertise in the context of breadth is something that I've realized is a really interesting challenge. As for what I've given the program, I don't know, maybe just a kind of crazy curiosity about everything.
Right.
I think of curiosity as like a kind of everyday superpower that people can actually cultivate rather than just be born with. But
I think you bring a love of music too, as well. Probably that maybe translates over into, into the what you're teaching.
Thanks. Yeah, it's funny because I find it sometimes easier to think about books when I route those ideas over into music or something like that,
Yeah.
into another form. And I've written, I mean, in Canada, of course, we have some great poetic literary musicians like the late great Gord Downie and Leonard Cohen, of course, and many others, and the late Neil Peart as well, I would say, and many living people too. They're not all dead. Yeah, well, the thing about music too is that it's got that connection to performance, which for me is always like, coming from Shakespeare studies, to me, a book is not just a book. If it's Shakespeare, there's something else that it has to call to mind, and that's a performance, whether it's a performance in the mind or a performance shared with others in a social space. And the pandemic has only focused us even more, I think, on the importance of performance.
Right.
There's nothing like having something taken away to make you appreciate it. So, yeah, I think, well, the role of digital materials too, I think, is very important. That's something I hope that our program continues to connect with, is not just looking at books as objects of the past, but publishing studies as a distinct but connected field with book history is very important. And the fact that there is a publishing industry in Canada, large and small, well, you're the expert on that in here. Thinking about book history not just as something from the past, but something as part of the living present and something with a future as well, not just in Canada, but elsewhere. And that's something that involves paper books like what we've been looking at, but also born digital texts of all kinds as well. And that's something that I think is really important, to connect those things, not just see them as one or the other, like you got to pick a team.
So true.
They're all part of the same continuum.
Well, even though you're leaving the directorship, I know you're still going to be an integral part of the program itself. You'll still be teaching in the program. So this has been great, Alan. It's always great to chat with you. You and Scott, who is going to be on in a couple of weeks, you're both two of my favorite users here at the Fisher Library. You're always great to chat with, not just about books, but about music, but about life. So it's I really appreciate you being on the episode today.
Well, thank you, John. I want to say how grateful I am to the Fisher staff, you and all the others here too, because this is, well, maybe that's one part of my answer to what have I learned from the book history program, is that it's not just the collections, it's the people at these libraries as well.
Exactly.
This is like an amazing, I'm looking up around me here, the amount of book history scholarship that's in this building embodied in the people is extraordinary. And scholarship combined with teaching, I mean, that's what scholarship is. And anyway, especially lately when I've been able to bring students back in, and I just kind of went nuts and said, oh, can I call up this? Can I call up that? Can I call up that? And tried not to add up the amount of money that all these materials cost in the room.
I know, but it's going to be so nice over the next few years when we do get out of this pandemic world to bring more students back in again. So, and I know you're going to be doing that as well with your classes. So,
well, they'll be joining a community that the Fisher has been a big part of.
Exactly.
So
again, Alan, thanks. As I said, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time when we'll have Scott Schofield, who's now teaching at Huron College at the University of Western Ontario. I guess they don't call it University of Western Ontario anymore, do they? Maybe it's just Western University. Who knows? But anyway,
it was Western Ontario when I went there, so
we can ask Scott.
But in a Joyce instance, it can be both at the same time.
Exactly. So Scott will bring a different perspective as well, similar to yours, but also Scott makes a lot of people don't know actually did work at the Fisher for a while. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So please join us in 2 weeks' time. And until then, have a great weekend and hopefully enjoy some warmer weather come the spring.